There is a force within us that transcends all words, a pure essence that cannot be tainted by others' opinions. This is a story about discovering that force, about understanding that we are far deeper than the words that try to define us. It is a journey that begins with pain but blossoms into wisdom. On the slopes of a sacred mountain, where soft mists embraced an ancient Buddhist temple each morning, lived a young monk who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of truth. The temple, built with centuries-old stones, housed many practitioners, but the young monk had a special task: to descend to the village every day to collect offerings that sustained the community. The path to the village wound through ancient trees, crossed a crystal-clear stream, and finally opened into the central square, where merchants set up their stalls at dawn. Among them was a spice merchant, a middle-aged man whose eyes bore the weight of many disappointments. Every morning, as the young monk passed by his stall, the merchant found a new way to humiliate him. "Look at this fool," he would shout, "dressed in rags and living off charity. What a waste of youth." The merchant's words were like poisoned arrows, each one laced with an extra dose of bitterness. The young monk, who had only recently left his family to follow the spiritual path, felt each word like a stone in his stomach. His hands trembled slightly as he held the offering bowl, and his face burned with shame under the curious gazes of the other merchants and shoppers. Days turned into weeks, and the merchant's taunts grew increasingly elaborate. He began to mimic the young monk's walk, mock his shaved head, and concoct fictional stories about why someone would choose a life of seclusion. He must have done something terrible in his village. He would whisper loud enough for everyone to hear. No one chooses to live like that without a good reason. The young monk's suffering was silent but profound. During his nightly meditations, the merchant's words echoed in his mind like an unwelcome mantra. He began to question his life choices, his calling, his worth as a human being. In his dreams, he faced imaginary confrontations with the merchant, sometimes fleeing in shame, other times responding with equal aggression. The offerings in his bowl began to dwindle. Some villagers, swayed by the merchant's words, started to view him with suspicion. Others, out of pity, avoided meeting his gaze altogether. The young monk began taking alternative routes through the town, longer, lonelier paths that kept him away from the central square. On his solitary walks, he observed how nature responded to adversity. He saw how bamboo bent with the wind without breaking, how the stream's water flowed gently around stones without losing its course. He began to sense that a profound lesson lay hidden within his suffering, though he could not yet fully grasp it. One particularly difficult morning, when the merchant's insults had been especially cruel, the young monk noticed something different within himself. As the harsh words struck his ears, a small part of his awareness remained detached, observing not only the words, but also his own reaction to them. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible moment, but it marked the beginning of a profound shift in his understanding. The sun was setting as the young monk returned to the temple that day. His bowl was lighter than usual, but something new had taken root in his heart. A question began to form in his mind. If words hold such power over us, who truly gives them that power? The young monk sat on his meditation mat that night, but peace felt distant. In his mind, every insult from the merchant had turned into a seed, and those seeds began to sprout into dark thoughts. First came doubts about himself, then anger, and finally, a deep desire for retaliation that frightened him. During the morning practices, while the other monks focused on their breathing, he found himself creating imaginary dialogues in which he finally confronted the merchant. In some of these daydreams, he responded with even harsher words. In others, he displayed such profound wisdom that the merchant was left humiliated in front of everyone. Each imagined scenario fueled an inner fire that began to consume his tranquility. The changes in his behavior were subtle but persistent. His once open and receptive posture had become more closed. His shoulders were constantly tense, as though carrying an invisible weight. During communal meals, he barely touched his food, his gaze distant, lost in thoughts of confrontation and vindication. Other monks began to notice these changes. During chanting practices, his voice, once clear and present, now trembled slightly. While working in the temple garden, his hands moved mechanically, devoid of the mindfulness the sacred task demanded. It was as if a dark cloud had settled over his being, blocking the light of his practice. One afternoon, while sweeping leaves in the temple courtyard, the young monk realized he was performing the task angrily. Each sweep of the broom was harsh, aggressive, as if the leaves were his negative emotions he was desperately trying to push away. Then, a dry leaf, carried by the wind, gently landed on his head. For a moment, he paused, feeling the delicate touch of nature in contrast to the turmoil within. The nights became particularly difficult. During evening meditations, when the temple was enveloped in silence, the merchant's words echoed even louder in his mind. Fool, worthless, coward. Each insult seemed to gain strength in the dark hours. His sleep was restless, filled with nightmares where he was chased by shadows, bearing the merchant's voice. On his daily walks to the village, he began developing protective rituals. Before leaving, he would take several deep breaths, trying to build an invisible armor around himself. He chose increasingly longer and more complicated paths, convincing himself he was simply enjoying different scenery, when in reality, he was avoiding confrontation. The offering bowl in his hands, once filled with gratitude and humility, now felt as heavy as lead. Each step toward the village was an internal battle. His heart raced at the sound of distant voices, fearing he might recognize the merchant's sarcastic tone among them. Even the offerings he received lost their sacred meaning. They became mere reminders of his daily ordeal. One morning, as he prepared for yet another descent to the village, the young monk caught sight of his reflection in a bucket of water. The face staring back at him was no longer the same as when he had arrived at the temple months ago. His eyes, once bright with spiritual determination, now carried a shadow of fear and resentment. It was in this moment that he realized how much power he had given to the words of a stranger. The sun was already high when he finally began his descent that day. Each step was heavier than the last, not just because of the steep path, but also due to the weight of the emotions he carried. Yet, something was different. The awareness of his own transformation had planted a new seed, not one of anger, but of questioning. How could words, mere vibrations in the air, hold such power over his being? The temple master, an elderly monk with kind eyes and silent steps, had been observing the transformation of his young disciple with compassionate attention. For weeks, he had watched his shadows gathered in the young monk's heart, like dark clouds before a storm. That afternoon, as the sun painted the sky in hues of orange, he decided it was time to intervene. The young monk was sitting alone in the temple garden, his mind still restless from the day's events, when he felt a serene presence beside him. The master had approached so silently that it seemed as though he had emerged from the very air. In his hands, he carried two bowls, one completely empty and the other brimming with dark stones. Without a word, the master sat beside the young monk and placed the two bowls on the ground between them. Silence stretched for several minutes, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. The young monk looked at the bowls, confused, waiting for an explanation that did not come. Finally, the master picked up a stone from the full bowl and offered it to the young monk. "What do you see?" he asked in a gentle voice. The young monk examined the stone in his hands. It was rough, irregular, with edges that slightly pricked his fingers. "I see a stone that can hurt," he replied, immediately thinking of the merchant's painful words. The master then picked up the empty bowl and began to tap it gently with a small branch. The sound it produced was clear, melodic, resonating through the garden. Next, he took the bowl filled with stones and did the same. This time, the sound was muffled, almost non-existent. "What do you hear?" asked the master. The young monk furrowed his brow, trying to grasp the meaning of this demonstration. He observed how the empty bowl produced a beautiful, clear sound, while the bowl filled with stones could barely resonate. Slowly, understanding began to dawn in his mind. "A mind full of stones cannot produce music," the master continued, "just as a heart full of grudges cannot receive wisdom. Each insult you carry is like one of these stones. The question is not how many stones the merchant tries to give you, but how many you choose to keep." The master then began removing the stones from the full bowl, one by one, placing them on the ground. With each stone removed, he tapped the bowl again, and the sound became gradually clearer, more resonant. Your daily practices, your meditation, your studies, all of these are meant to empty your bowl, not fill it with more stones. The young monk watched, fascinated, as the bowl was emptied. Each stone removed seemed to represent the weight he himself had been carrying, the fear of encountering the merchant, the anger at the humiliations, the shame in front of the villagers. "But master," the young monk asked, "how can I prevent these stones from piling up? How can I keep my bowl empty when every day more stones are thrown into it?" The master smiled kindly and picked up one last stone, holding it over the now empty bowl. "Watch," he said, releasing the stone. Instead of landing in the bowl, it rolled off, falling softly onto the grass. "A bowl may appear empty to the world," the master continued, "but it is, in truth, full of space. It is this space that makes it useful. In the same way, when your mind is free of judgment and reaction, it is actually filled with wisdom and compassion. The stones stay only if you create a place for them." The sun had already set when the master rose to leave. Before departing, he placed the empty bowl into the young monk's hands. "Carry this bowl to the village tomorrow," he said, "and observe how it receives offerings differently from stones." Now alone in the darkened garden, the young monk held the empty bowl in his hands, feeling its weight, or rather, its lightness. For the first time in weeks, his mind was as clear as the sound the empty bowl had produced. The next morning, the young monk awoke before sunrise. The empty bowl his master had given him lay beside his mat, glowing faintly in the dim light. As he prepared for his daily journey to the village, something within him felt different. The usual anxiety was still there, but now it was accompanied by a new curiosity, a desire to observe the world with fresh eyes. Arriving at the village, he decided to do something he had never done before: sit quietly in a corner of the square before the market stalls were set up. The empty bowl rested on his lap, reflecting the first rays of sunlight. From this vantage point, he began to observe the merchants arriving one by one, as though watching a play unfold. The merchant who often insulted him arrived carrying his spices. For the first time, the young monk noticed how tense the man's movements were, his brows perpetually furrowed. He watched as the merchant arranged his stall with harsh, hurried gestures, muttering to himself. It was as though he bore an invisible burden far heavier than his goods. As the morning wore on, the young monk witnessed something revealing. The merchant's sharp words were not reserved for him alone. With some customers, he was curt and impatient. With other merchants, he exchanged bitter remarks. Yet, when a wealthy patron or a village official approached, his demeanor changed entirely. He became servile, almost obsequious. One particularly striking scene unfolded when an elderly woman accidentally knocked over some of his products. The merchant erupted in fury, his words as harsh as those he had often hurled at the young monk. The woman trembled, tears streaming down her face. Nearby merchants looked away in discomfort, some shaking their heads in disapproval. At that moment, a realization dawned upon the young monk. Like the empty bowl in his lap, he could now see clearly. The merchant's words were never about him. They never had been. They were reflections of a troubled mind, like ripples on a cloudy lake. Each insult, each harsh word, was merely an echo of the merchant's own inner suffering. Watching more closely, he noticed other details. The merchant would occasionally touch a small amulet around his neck with nervous fingers. His gaze often drifted off to a distant point, and in those moments, his expression revealed a profound sadness. During these silent pauses, it seemed as if he carried the weight of countless untold stories. The young monk recalled his master's teaching about the empty bowl. Just as it did not hold on to the stones thrown into it, he did not have to retain the insults he received. He could let them pass like clouds drifting across the sky without allowing them to settle in his heart. As the sun climbed higher, the young monk began to feel something unexpected growing within him: compassion. Each harsh word he heard from the merchant now sounded different. They were no longer arrows aimed to wound, but cries for help from someone trapped in his own suffering. A child ran through the square, laughing brightly. For a brief moment, the merchant followed the child with his gaze, and his face softened into something resembling a smile. It was fleeting but telling. Even the murkiest lake has moments of clarity, the young monk thought. The morning wore on, and a deeper understanding took root within him. The young monk realized that just as his empty bowl had space to receive offerings, his mind now had space for a new perspective. The insults were no longer obstacles on his spiritual path, but opportunities to practice compassion. By midday, when the sun was at its peak, the young monk rose from his corner in the square. His bowl remained empty of material offerings, but his heart was full of a newfound understanding that no insult could shake. He had learned that true practice was not about avoiding the stones others threw, but about remaining as spacious as the empty bowl, able to receive everything without holding on to anything. The days that followed brought a subtle yet profound shift in the young monk's routine. His walk to the village was no longer a journey filled with apprehension, but rather a practice of mindfulness. The empty bowl in his hands had become his silent teacher, constantly reminding him of the spacious nature of his own mind. On a particularly clear morning, as he descended the mountain trail, a bird began to accompany him, hopping from branch to branch. The young monk watched how the bird moved with complete freedom, never lingering in one spot. When a branch swayed too much, the bird simply flew to another, bearing no resentment toward the branch that had unsettled it. Reaching the village square, the merchant was already there, his mood seemingly more sour than usual. He began his customary round of taunts the moment he spotted the young monk. But something extraordinary happened. The words seemed to pass through the monk like a breeze through the leaves of a tree. The bird that had followed him landed on a nearby rooftop, watching the scene with its bright eyes. The young monk realized that just as the bird was unaffected by the swaying branches, he didn't need to be disturbed by the sway of words. He could remain steady in his own nature, unaffected by external turbulence. As the merchant continued his tirade, the young monk noticed how his own breathing remained calm, his heart at peace. Words that once felt like sharp arrows now seemed like soap bubbles, seemingly solid, but dissolving upon contact with present awareness. A group of children ran past, chasing a colorful kite in the sky. The merchant paused his insults for a moment, his gaze involuntarily following the kite's movement. The young monk observed how even the heaviest thoughts could be momentarily suspended by the simple beauty of the present moment. Later that afternoon, something unusual occurred. A sudden storm rolled in, catching everyone off guard. While the merchants scrambled to protect their goods, the young monk noticed that the merchant who always insulted him was struggling with his spices. Without hesitation, the monk approached to help, using his own robe to shield the goods from the rain. The merchant looked visibly perplexed by this act of kindness. For a moment, his defenses dropped, and the young monk caught a glimpse of something he had never seen before: vulnerability. It was as if, for a fleeting instant, the mask of bitterness had been washed away by the rain. Working side by side to save the spices, no words were exchanged, yet something fundamental had shifted. The young monk realized that his inner transformation had created ripples extending beyond himself, touching even the one who sought to harm him. When the storm passed, the bird returned, shaking the rain from its feathers on a nearby branch. The young monk smiled, recognizing in that simple act the profound truth. Just as the bird did not carry the storm's water, he did not need to carry the weight of harsh words. The days that followed brought a new quality to his visits to the village. His presence had become like the empty bowl itself, open, spacious, capable of holding both kindness and hostility without being defined by either. The merchant's insults persisted, but they seemed to lose their power before reaching him, like waves dissipating upon a calm shore. The other villagers began to notice the change. Where once they saw a young monk trying to hide, they now encountered a serene and welcoming presence. Their offerings, which had dwindled under the merchant's harsh words, began to increase again, not out of pity or obligation, but from a genuine connection to this transformed presence. The bird became a regular companion on his walks, sometimes following him, other times simply watching from afar. To the young monk, it became a living reminder of how one could move through the world with lightness, unburdened by the winds of circumstance or the weight of others' opinions. On a golden autumn morning, as the leaves danced gently in the breeze, the young monk made his usual descent to the village. The empty bowl in his hands felt no heavier than a feather, and his heart was as light as the clouds drifting across the sky. The bird, his silent companion, flew ahead, as if announcing his arrival. The merchant was already at his usual spot, and upon seeing the young monk approaching, he prepared for his daily routine of insults. But this time, something was different. The young monk did not alter his path, nor did he lower his gaze. He walked directly to the merchant's stall, his steps firm and serene. "Look who's here!" the merchant began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The begging monk who thinks he's better than the rest of us. Why don't you get a real job instead of living off others?" His words shot out like poisoned arrows, but something extraordinary happened. They seemed to dissolve into the air before they could find their mark. The young monk, with a gentle smile, looked directly into the merchant's eyes and, for the first time in all those months, spoke. "Allow me to tell you a story," he said, his voice clear and calm like a mountain stream. "There was a man who offered gifts to another every day, but the recipient never accepted them. Over time, to whom did the gifts belong?" The merchant, caught off guard by this unexpected response, was silent for the first time in months. His face showed confusion, then understanding, and finally, a trace of shame. The onlookers, who had paused to witness the scene, also fell into reflective silence. "All these months," the young monk continued, "you've been offering me gifts, your words, your opinions, your judgments. But today, I understand fully that I never needed to accept them. Just like this empty bowl," he lifted the bowl in his hands, "my true nature remains unaffected by what others try to put into it." The bird landed on a nearby branch, its soft song echoing through the quiet square. The merchant looked down at his own hands, as if seeing for the first time the burden they carried, not spices, but bitterness and resentment. "Every insult you've hurled," the young monk went on, "was like a heavy stone you carried. In trying to harm me with them, it was you who bore their weight. Now I see that true freedom doesn't lie in avoiding the stones others throw, but in realizing we don't need to pick them up." Silent tears began to roll down the merchant's face. Years of accumulated bitterness seemed to melt under the warmth of this simple truth. The young monk, with infinite compassion, placed his empty bowl on the merchant's stall. "See," he said softly, "when a bowl is truly empty, it cannot be harmed. It simply resonates like a bell, transforming any touch into music. In the same way, when our minds are free from attachment to insults or praise, we discover a peace that nothing can disturb. The merchant touched the bowl with trembling fingers, and the soft sound it produced rang out through the square like a call to mindfulness. In that moment, something profound shifted, not just between the two of them, but in everyone who bore witness to the scene. No one can insult us without our permission. The words of others only hold the power we grant them. Our true nature is like the vast sky clouds may pass, storms may rage, but the sky remains unchanged, ever spacious, ever free. Insults are like passing clouds. They only affect us when we forget our fundamental nature. True liberation lies not in controlling what others say or do, but in keeping our minds as spacious as the sky, as empty as the bowl, as free as the bird in flight. When we deeply understand this, we discover a peace that no words can disturb, a freedom that no insult can imprison. For in the end, they are just words, vibrations in the air that we can choose not to carry. And in that choice lies our true strength, our true freedom, our true nature.